You know, we humans have this incredible, powerful drive to understand everything. It's what gave us modern medicine, amazing technology, all of it. But that quest for knowledge, it has a really dark side. A history filled with moments where the line between scientific discovery and just monstrous cruelty wasn't just crossed, it was completely erased.
So that's the big question, right? How far is too far? At what point does the search for a breakthrough justify making another human being suffer? Today, we're going to look at 5 true stories from history that force us to stare that dilemma right in the face.
All right, so here's the roadmap. We're going to start way back in ancient Alexandria, then jump to the nuclear panic of the Cold War. We'll peek inside a secret Soviet poison lab, uncover a truly horrific study in Guatemala, and we'll end with one of the absolute darkest chapters in the entire history of science.
Okay, let's set the scene. It's the 4th century BC. We're in Alexandria, Egypt, which is basically the world's brainiac capital at the time. And there's this Greek doctor, Herophilus, who's absolutely obsessed with figuring out what's going on inside the human body. He wanted to map everything. But the method he chose, well, it was something else. He and his student didn't just dissect dead bodies. Oh no. They performed vivisections on live, condemned criminals that the king basically handed over to them. And you gotta remember, anesthetics didn't exist. There was nothing to numb the pain. So these people felt every single cut. And he did it in public, like a show for everyone to watch. I mean, the impact was huge, but so was the horror, right? Herophilus discovered incredible things about our nerves, our eyes, our organs, things no one knew. But his methods were so unbelievably extreme that after he died, people were so freaked out that human dissection basically became taboo for almost 1,800 years. The knowledge was revolutionary for sure, but the price was just unimaginable.
All right, let's jump way forward in time to a totally different world, the Cold War. It's 1954. The US and the Soviet Union are in this terrifying race to build bigger and badder nuclear bombs. And the American testing ground for these weapons was a remote place in the Pacific called the Marshall Islands.
The sheer scale of this is hard to wrap your head around. The test was called Castle Bravo, and it was supposed to be a 6-megaton explosion. But they got their math wrong, horribly wrong. It ended up being a 15-megaton blast. That's over 1,000 times stronger than the bomb that leveled Hiroshima. And lying directly in the path of the radioactive fallout were hundreds of people living on the islands.
But it's what happened after the blasts that is so chilling. The US government called it an unfortunate accident, but they immediately kicked off something called Project 4.1. It was a secret study to see what all that radiation would do to the 239 people who had been exposed. So you've got officials saying, oh, don't worry, no long-term effects. But the reality for the people on the ground, it was a nightmare. Radiation sickness, a huge spike in miscarriages and stillbirths, and within 20 years, a third of them had developed tumors. It became a human experiment that started with a terrible mistake.
Okay, let's switch gears and head over to the early Soviet Union. Back then, if you were a political opponent of the government, you had this weird tendency to, well, die suddenly. And it wasn't a coincidence. It was the work of a secret lab set up back in 1921, known only as the Kammer, which just means the chamber. The whole point of the Kochmauer was to create the perfect assassination tool. They wanted a poison you couldn't see, couldn't smell, and couldn't taste. A poison that would leave no trace behind for a coroner to find. And who were their test subjects? Prisoners from the Gulag, the brutal labor camps. They were given these deadly poisons, usually disguised as medicine, while doctors watched them die, taking notes.
And you know what? They actually pulled it off. Their prize-winning creation was a poison they called C2. Unlike cyanide, which causes a violent death, C2 did something much more subtle. It just made a person get very weak, very quiet, and they would die peacefully within about 15 minutes. It was the perfect murder weapon for a state that wanted its enemies to just disappear. This next one, this one is really tough. And it's shocking because it was conducted by the United States Public Health Service. You've probably heard of the Tuskegee study, where American doctors just stood by and watched as syphilis destroyed black men. Well, between 1946 and 1948 in Guatemala, U.S. researchers took things to a whole new level of horror.
See, this wasn't about watching a disease that was already there. The goal was to test penicillin, but to do that, they decided they needed to intentionally infect healthy people. And their subjects? Over 1,300 Guatemalan soldiers, prisoners, orphans, and even patients in psychiatric hospitals. The most vulnerable people you can imagine. people who couldn't possibly consent. They were infected with syphilis and gonorrhea on purpose.
And here's where the story takes a turn that's, well, it's just sickening to even talk about. This quote is from the researchers' own notes. It's about a psychiatric patient named Berta. After they infected her with syphilis as she was literally dying, the lead doctor decided to infect her again. He put pus from a man with gonorrhea into her eyes and her private parts. She was dead 3 days later. And the worst part, the absolute kick in the teeth, no useful medical data ever came out of it. None. It was just pointless, sadistic cruelty disguised as science.
Okay, for our last story, we're going to what might be the single darkest chapter in the history of medical science. During World War II, the Imperial Japanese Army operated a top-secret biological and chemical warfare unit in China. It was called Unit 731.
So on the outside, it just looked like a lumber mill. Totally innocent. But inside, hundreds of thousands of prisoners, Chinese, Russian, men, women, and even children, were subjected to experiments so awful they sound like something from a horror movie. And to make it easier to do what they were doing, the staff didn't call the prisoners people. They called them maruta, the Japanese word for logs, as in pieces of wood to be used and discarded.
What they did to these people, it's almost too much to list. Vivisections on conscious people were routine. They would slowly dehydrate people to death just to see how much water loss a body could take. They'd put people in pressure chambers and watch until their eyes popped out of their sockets. And you want to know the rationale? A professor who saw it all said that a lot of it wasn't even for military research. It was just professional curiosity. Can you even imagine?
But here it is, the final, disgusting twist in this whole story. After the war, the Soviets actually captured and tried a dozen of the leaders from Unit 731. But the United States, they got a hold of the head scientists and they made a deal. They gave these war criminals complete immunity, no trials, no prison time, and in exchange, they got all the research data. The US government argued the data was incredibly valuable precisely because it was, and this is their word, ethically unobtainable. They couldn't do the experiments themselves, so they bought the results from monsters.
And that just leaves us in a really uncomfortable place, doesn't it? The data from Unit 731, data from torture, was folded into American research programs. So we're right back where we started. So let me ask you this, and really think about it. If you were sick, and the only cure came from data gathered through pure evil, would you take it? And could you ever call that progress?